With the recent spike in cases of COVID in Sydney, the need for everyone to get vaccinated, of course, is in the spotlight. So should employers look to incentivise the jab? Joydeep Kaur from People and Culture and Strategies joining us now live. Joydeep, good to talk to you again. Yeah, this is an issue, isn't it, that we've been talking about for a while, about how you actually convince people to get the jab. There has been some reluctance. Clearly in relation to, for the older people, I guess, who are receiving the AstraZeneca jab. So how do you go about changing that mindset?
Yeah, look, you just have to respect and appreciate, to start off with, that this certainly has been a polarising issue. I think it'll continue to be a polarising issue. I think employers and business can expect that when situations happen, like is currently happening in Sydney, and of course that Melbourne has had happen more recently and a couple of times, there will be an understanding that the strength of people's views about these kinds of matters may be having a broader societal impact. And certainly when we have our political leaders coming out and saying that the only way that we're going to be able to stop these lockdowns and ease these restrictions, or indeed not implement these restrictions, is if everyone gets vaccinated. You would like to think and hope that does change people's minds. But as I said, it is a polarising issue, and a number of people will have these strongly held views about it and will persist in those views. So changing people's mindset on something like this requires appropriate dissemination of information, an understanding that, or a real intent to try to give them the necessary information that they need to have to make an informed decision, and then hopefully relying on broader societal impact, but certainly not easy. And I think the other layer is that when you bring that into the workplace context, it takes on a whole new dimension, because there are already a number of employees, rightly or wrongly, who will have views about the parameters within which their employer can be directing or forcing them to do anything. And so this would be sitting very high on their list.
Okay, so if we're talking about incentivising, what's that look like?
So we had a lot of conversations with clients and organisations over the last few weeks who have wanted to incentivate employees to be vaccinated, and some have talked about things such as immediate kind of cash bonuses, not massive amounts, vouchers, some kind of monetary recognition. I think the more sensible organisations have thought about this a little bit more broadly. And one thing that I've seen work quite well is organisations who said, recognising that an employee is probably going to need to have 2 separate days, given the 2 doses of the vaccine, that they might need to take as days off, rather than them being required to take that as annual leave or have that deducted from their sick leave. They are given not just the time that it would take for that particular vaccine, the hour or whatever that the duration might be, but instead they get that whole day as an extra day of paid leave. Now, that also has the advantage of covering the employer and the employee if there's any side effects or reactions post the vaccination. So that's a good way to provide an incentive. Obviously, if someone manages it in such a way that they have no reactions, then they can have that day off, and that's a bit of a bonus, equivalent to 10% of their annual leave allocation for a particular year. So it's not insignificant. So they're the kinds of things that are working. A lot of employers are saying, in the event that there is any side effect that requires a person to take additional time off, that too will not be deducted from their sick leave. So employers just thinking more laterally around the support mechanisms they have to give to their employees, rather than that very gratuitous, here's some money if you get vaccinated.
So if you're talking about incentives, should this be driven by the government or by the private sector?
Well, I think that the government has obviously strongly encouraged. It remains to be the position. It's not yet the position that being vaccinated is mandatory. I think in the same way that the government has to think about what messages it sends, employers have to think about corresponding messages. I think everything is always assisted from a private sector perspective, where the government is very clear on a particular position. It allows private sector employers to be saying, well, the government has made this clear and we are doing what is required of us, or being asked of us. Where the tensions arise is where the government is not necessarily forcing something or mandating something, and then it becomes something that the employer has to do, because in the minds of the employee, they are seeing the employer as going over and above, and in many instances probably seeing them being unfair or unreasonable in doing so.
All right, so let's focus then on productivity. Clearly, that would be an issue, I guess, later in the year if the majority of the population is vaccinated. If companies have employees that aren't vaccinated, that presents a problem, does it not? In terms of potential lost days, when we're talking about productivity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the starting point for the whole vaccination question, of course, is that the employer, every employer, should be considering and looking at what is reasonable within the context of our organisation for us to be mandating. Are we in a sector, or are we the type of business or organisation where we can say as the employer, as the business, that it is a reasonable direction for us to say to our employees that you need to be vaccinated. Now, the question of productivity will very much be around, will an employer be able to say, because of the impact on productivity alone, we're going to insist on vaccination? That will go against the grain of what over many years has been regarded the scope of a lawful or reasonable direction. So that could be interesting if it's for reasons of productivity alone. Of course, if it goes to the viability of an organisation because, for example, it's in the aged care sector or one of those very frontline facing industries or sectors, that's a different proposition. And I think organisations will get support from the courts and tribunals that it is absolutely within their rights to insist on it in that situation. So the productivity question will be an interesting one to see how that plays out.
Yeah, you mentioned that word lawful. It does beg the question whether perhaps this is a potential legal minefield. What are your thoughts, and particularly if there is some pushback that we're likely to see it hit the courts? Yeah,
so there have already been a couple of cases which have gone to the Fair Work Commission where an employee has refused to be vaccinated, not in relation to the COVID vaccine, but in relation to flu vaccines and other things. So this will play out without a doubt over the next few months. My prediction is that the Fair Work Commission is going to say this is a pretty serious and significant issue, and I think will give employers a fair amount of leeway in terms of pushing the boundaries on it. But they will expect those employers to communicate clearly and reasonably with their employees, explain the justifications for why the employer is adopting a particular position, and we'll expect an employer to work collaboratively with let's call it a reluctant or resistant employee, to get them across the line on something. I think employers who are seen as cavalier and just jumping to termination just because someone said no to a vaccine, and there's only been a single communication with the employee in relation to it, probably going to find themselves come unstuck. But there will be a lot of activity in this space in the next few weeks and months.
Joydeep, always good to get your views from People, Culture and Strategies. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.